Welcome back, everyone. We've got another deep dive for you, and this time it looks like we're heading back to ancient Greece.
Oh, yeah. Looking forward to this one.
You guys sent us some pretty fascinating stuff. This time around a lot on relationships and sexuality in ancient Greece. So
Yeah.
it seems like there's a lot to unpack here, especially with, the whole popular image of ancient Greece as like,
Yeah.
well, a little bit more open-minded than it actually was.
Right. We often get that kind of romantic view of ancient Greece.
Yeah.
Imagining it as this place where homosexuality was not only accepted, but even celebrated. But looking through the material you guys sent, especially this book by Adonis Georgiades,
Yeah.
Homosexuality in Ancient Greece, the myth is collapsing. It seems like it's painting a different picture.
It really does. And Georgiades is going right for those assumptions, too. He's using actual, ancient Greek texts and laws as his evidence. So
Yeah.
he's got some pretty strong arguments there. One thing that really struck me was how much he emphasizes the importance of language. He actually says that using modern terms like homosexual and heterosexual to talk about ancient Greece,
Yeah.
that it can actually distort our understanding.
Absolutely. I think that's such a crucial point.
Yeah.
We can't just take our own modern categories and slap them onto the past, right?
Right.
The ancient Greeks had their own ways of understanding and, categorizing relationships and sexual behavior.
Yeah.
And they might not necessarily line up with our modern ideas. For example, Georgiades points out that the ancient Greeks used some pretty negative terms when talking about certain homosexual acts. So it suggests that there was definitely some level of disapproval there.
Yeah, it's like trying to force puzzle pieces that don't fit together.
Exactly.
And speaking of specifics, what about the actual laws in ancient Greece? I mean, didn't both Sparta and Athens have pretty strict laws against homosexual behavior?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
I remember reading about that Athenian law that punished men for relationships with boys.
You're right. And it's interesting to note that those laws weren't just about sexual acts in themselves. They were really tied up with social hierarchies and power dynamics.
Oh, that's interesting.
Like that Athenian law you mentioned. It specifically targeted relationships where one partner was significantly older than the other and had some kind of authority over them. So it shows you that they were worried about protecting young people.
Interesting.
And preventing abuse of power in those relationships.
But if these relationships were supposed to be mostly about mentorship, like some people argue, then why were there laws against them?
That's a great question. And it really shows just how nuanced and complex ancient Greek society was.
Yeah.
While the ideal might have focused on mentorship and education, those laws show that there were worries about potential harm.
Yeah.
Don't forget, ancient Greek society put a lot of emphasis on social order and clear distinctions between different age groups and roles. So in a way, these laws reflect those anxieties.
So it's not a simple black and white issue. It's fascinating how much the laws themselves reveal about a society's values.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And even their anxieties, too.
Yeah.
Now, another point Georgiades brings up is how the very terms lover and loved one had different meanings back then.
Right.
It wasn't necessarily about, romantic or sexual love the way we understand it now.
Exactly. They often referred to a relationship focused on, mentorship and education. You could think of it almost like a teacher-student dynamic.
Oh, okay.
Where the older, more experienced man is guiding the younger one in his development as a citizen and a man.
Yeah.
Understanding this context is really key when you're looking at ancient Greek texts and relationships.
That makes sense. And there's that great example in Xenophon's Memorabilia, right?
Yeah.
Where Socrates discourages his student Critias from having sexual desires for his loved one, Euthydemus.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It really does seem to reinforce the idea that these relationships weren't necessarily inherently sexual. Could you maybe unpack that a little for our listeners?
Absolutely. That passage from Xenophon is really important because it challenges this common idea that Socrates, and by extension, Plato, endorsed homosexual behavior as we understand it today.
Yeah.
Remember, Socrates in that dialogue represents Plato's philosophical views.
Right.
And he's emphasizing self-control and directing desires towards things like virtue and intellectual pursuit,
Okay.
rather than just physical pleasure.
So Plato's Symposium, which is often cited as evidence for the Greeks accepting homosexuality,
Yeah.
that might actually be saying something very different.
Exactly. The symposium actually draws a clear line between what it calls vulgar Aphrodite, which is basically just physical desire,
Oh.
or lust, and celestial Aphrodite, which is this higher form of love focused on the soul and beauty and virtue.
Wow, that's fascinating. So Plato was actually advocating for a kind of love that went beyond the physical.
In a way, yes. In the Symposium, Socrates argues that true love should be directed towards something greater than just bodily pleasure. He believed that love should inspire us to strive for things like wisdom and virtue and beauty in every aspect of life. And remember, in the dialogue, Socrates himself actually rejects the advances of Alcibiades.
All right.
Even though he's considered Alcibiades' lover. So this suggests, again, that these relationships weren't always defined by sexual intimacy.
Okay, so it's way more complex than just saying the ancient Greeks embraced homosexuality.
Right. It's much more nuanced.
Yeah. Speaking of interpretations, let's talk about Alexander the Great.
Okay.
He's a figure who's often subject to modern misinterpretations. There's this popular belief that he was homosexual.
Yeah.
What do the actual historical sources tell us about that?
Well, the historical evidence actually goes against that claim. Ancient writers like Plutarch and Athenaeus, they specifically state that Alexander was pretty temperate in his desires.
Oh, interesting.
And that he didn't really show any inclination toward homosexuality. There's even an anecdote where Alexander rebukes somebody for suggesting that he buy a young boy, which shows you his disapproval of these practices.
Yeah, that doesn't really sound like someone embracing a homosexual lifestyle.
Right.
It makes you wonder what other so-called historical truths are out there that are actually based on like misunderstandings or our own modern biases.
Absolutely. It really highlights how important it is to look at these historical figures within their own time and culture instead of just projecting our own values and assumptions onto the past.
It definitely seems like there's a lot more to the story of Alexander the Great than we usually hear.
Yeah, for sure.
But we've got to talk about those ancient Greek vases.
Oh, yeah.
They're often presented as like visual proof of widespread homosexuality in ancient Greece.
Right.
But is that really an accurate interpretation?
I think it's a pretty selective interpretation. First of all, even when you see these homosexual themes on the vases, they rarely actually depict explicit sexual acts.
Oh.
And there's this tendency to read into the imagery, like to see latent homosexual feelings.
Right.
Even in scenes that are completely unrelated.
It's almost like people are seeing what they want to see.
Yeah,
instead of what's actually there. I remember Georgiades using examples from Dover's book, which is supposed to be like a key source on this. He talks about how they interpret scenes of wrestlers or men supporting each other while they're sick as having these latent homosexual feelings.
It's a classic example of confirmation bias. We're looking for evidence to back up an idea we already have, and then we end up interpreting these ambiguous images through that lens.
And let's not forget, ancient Greek pottery was a big industry.
Exactly.
It's possible that some of those scenes were just, catering to market demand.
Right.
Not necessarily reflecting actual societal norms.
Yeah. It makes you wonder how many other historical narratives are based on these kinds of interpretations.
It's like we're putting together a puzzle, but we're missing pieces, and then we're just filling in the gaps with our imaginations. That's a great way to put it. And it brings up a really important question. If this traditional image of ancient Greece as a homosexual paradise is so inaccurate, what other assumptions about history might we be carrying around?
Yeah, what other pieces of the puzzle are we missing or misinterpreting?
It's definitely made me question my own assumptions about ancient Greek sexuality.
For sure.
The reality, it seems way more complex than the simple narrative you usually hear.
Absolutely.
And we've only just scratched the surface here.
That's right. There's still so much more to explore and uncover about the nuances of ancient Greek relationships and sexuality.
Stick around because we've got a lot more to dig into in this deep dive.
Can't wait.
Wow. This deep dive is really making me rethink some things.
Yeah.
I think what's hitting me the hardest is how this goes beyond just ancient Greece,
Yeah, definitely.
Like, it makes you think about how we approach history in general and how easy it is to just let our modern views color how we interpret the past.
Absolutely. It's a classic case of how our own preconceived notions can just lead to all these misunderstandings.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder to always be questioning those assumptions,
Right.
and to always look at historical sources with a critical eye, especially when you're dealing with something as complex and nuanced as sexuality.
It really makes you wonder what other historical truths we're holding on to that are actually based on incomplete information.
Oh, yeah.
Or just biased interpretations.
For sure, history is not like the static thing.
Yeah.
It's a constant conversation, We're always reevaluating and reinterpreting the past as new evidence pops up and as we get new perspectives.
I love that history is a conversation.
Right.
That's a great way to put it. And this conversation about ancient Greek sexuality has definitely given us a lot to think about.
It has.
Especially when it comes to those cultural biases we were talking about.
No doubt. It's super important to remember that the ancient Greeks lived in a totally different cultural context.
Right.
Their beliefs, values, social structures, all that. It was all shaped by their own unique experiences and circumstances, you know?
So how do we even start to understand a society that existed thousands of years ago?
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to something as personal and complex as sexuality. It feels almost impossible to just shed our modern perspective.
It is a challenge, but it's not impossible. And the sources you sent actually offer some really valuable insights into how the ancient Greeks thought about things like love and relationships and the pursuit of virtue, which was huge for them.
You mentioned this idea of celestial Aphrodite,
Right.
that higher form of love that Plato talked about in the Symposium. It's all about the soul, virtue, beauty.
Yeah.
But what did that actually look like, in ancient Greek society? How did that play out in everyday life?
Well, one way to understand it is through this concept of paideia, which was basically the idea of holistic education in ancient Greece.
Right.
It wasn't just about book smarts,
Yeah.
Paideia was about physical training, moral development, civic responsibility, the whole package.
Wow, so it's like they were training for life in general.
Exactly. It was about shaping well-rounded individuals who would then contribute to the well-being of the polis, the city-state.
Interesting. So those relationships between lovers and loved ones, at least in their ideal form,
Right.
they were meant to be part of this paideia.
Exactly. The older, more experienced man would guide the younger one, helping him develop not just knowledge and skills, but also virtue and character.
So shaping future citizens and leaders.
Exactly. Remember, we're talking about a society where citizenship was a huge deal.
Yeah.
Being a citizen meant you had a voice in government, you participated in public life, you contributed to the common good.
Right.
So these relationships, at least in their ideal form, were seen as vital for shaping responsible citizens and upholding the values of the community.
So it's not just about personal fulfillment. It's about the future of society.
Precisely.
Yep.
It highlights how important it is to understand the historical and cultural context of these relationships. We can't just look at it through our modern lens of love and sexuality.
Right.
We have to try to see it through their eyes,
That's a good point. Now, we've talked about the ideal,
Right.
but obviously not all relationships in ancient Greece were these perfect models of mentorship and virtue.
Of course not. Human nature being what it is. There were bound to be cases where things went wrong, where power was abused.
Yeah. And those laws we talked about earlier, the ones that specifically punished certain types of relationships between men and boys,
Right.
they suggest that the ancient Greeks knew this could happen.
Yeah.
And they wanted to protect the vulnerable, especially young people.
Exactly. It shows a real awareness of the potential for harm.
It seems like there's this tension between the idealized view of these relationships and the reality of how people actually behave.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like they were trying to build this framework for these relationships to make sure they serve their purpose of education and mentorship, but also recognizing that there was always this potential for things to go wrong.
It reminds us that even back then, people were grappling with these complex social issues.
Absolutely.
And trying to navigate them through laws and customs. Speaking of complex issues, let's talk about arlete.
Ah, yes, ardete. It's usually translated as virtue or excellence, but it means so much more than that.
Okay.
Arete was about striving for greatness, fulfilling your potential, living a life worthy of admiration.
Wow.
It was a huge driving force in ancient Greek society, pushing people to excel in everything they did: athletics, art, politics, even warfare.
So it wasn't just about being a good person. It was about pushing yourself to be the best you could be.
You got it. Arete was about achieving excellence in every aspect of life, embodying those highest ideals of your society, and leaving a legacy that would inspire future generations.
And that wasn't just for a select few, right?
Nope. It was an ideal that you saw at every level of society, from the farmer to the statesman.
It's like they believed that everyone had the potential for greatness.
Exactly. And that's a powerful idea that still holds true today. We can all strive for excellence in our own lives, to be the best versions of ourselves, and to make a positive impact on the world.
I love that. It's like, even though there are thousands of years between us, we still share these basic human aspirations with the ancient Greeks. We all want to live meaningful lives, make a difference, leave our mark.
That's the beauty of studying history. You connect with those who came before us,
Yeah.
learn from their experiences, and gain a deeper understanding of ourselves and our own humanity.
This deep dive has been such a journey of discovery.
It has.
It's amazing how much we can learn about ourselves by looking back at the past.
It is.
But I have a feeling we're not quite done yet.
Not quite.
Yeah.
There's one more aspect of ancient Greek sexuality that we need to talk about. One that often gets overlooked or misunderstood.
Oh, I'm sensing another myth-busting moment here.
Maybe. And it's something that really makes us consider the full spectrum of human experience, even in ancient times.
Okay, you got me hooked. Tell me more.
Well, you see, despite all this emphasis on same-sex relationships between men, the ancient Greeks also recognized and depicted. Well, you see, despite all this emphasis on same-sex relationships between men, the ancient Greeks also recognized and depicted female homosexuality.
Oh, wow. Yeah, you don't really hear that discussed very often when people talk about ancient Greece.
It's true. It often gets kind of overshadowed by the focus on male relationships. But the sources you sent actually show that female homosexuality, while maybe not as openly talked about or depicted as male homosexuality, was definitely a thing in ancient Greek society.
Okay, I'm really interested to hear more about this.
Yeah.
What can you tell us about how it was viewed or experienced back then?
Well, it seems like it was more accepted in some contexts than others. For example, on the island of Lesbos,
Oh, right.
there was this tradition of strong emotional bonds and even romantic relationships between women.
Yeah.
That's actually where we get the term lesbian from.
Oh, that's right. The poet Sappho lived on Lesbos,
Mm.
and her writing is full of, passionate love for women.
Exactly. Sappho's poetry gives us this amazing glimpse into the world of female relationships in ancient Greece. And even though her work was admired for its beauty and its emotional depth, it also caused some controversy and debate even back then.
It's interesting how even in ancient times, you had these different opinions and levels of acceptance when it came to sexuality.
Yeah.
It's like some things never change.
Right. Human nature is what it is. It reminds us that ancient Greece wasn't this uniform society. There were variations in beliefs and practices across different regions and social groups, just like in any society.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah,
And those differences obviously showed up in their attitudes towards sexuality, too.
exactly.
So Sappho seems to be our main source for understanding this aspect of ancient Greece. What else can we learn from her poetry?
Sappho's poems show a really complex and nuanced understanding of love, desire, and the bonds between women. She writes about longing, jealousy, the pain of separation, the joy of reunion, all of it.
Yeah.
Her work captures the full range of human emotions, regardless of gender or sexual orientation.
It's amazing that these poems have survived for thousands of years,
I know, it's incredible.
giving us this window into the lives and loves of women in ancient Greece.
It really humanizes them.
It really does. It makes you realize they were just like us.
Exactly. Real people with real emotions.
This whole deep dive has seriously challenged my own ideas about ancient Greek sexuality. It's been a journey of myth-busting and critical thinking,
For sure.
and some genuine surprises along the way.
That's the power of history, right? It's full of twists and turns, and it's always making us question what we thought we knew.
So what's the big takeaway here? What should our listeners be thinking about after this deep dive?
I think the most important thing is to remember to question your assumptions. Don't just take historical narratives at face value, especially when it comes to something as complex and often misunderstood as sexuality. Dig deeper, look at the sources with a critical eye,
Yeah.
and be open to the possibility that the past might be way different than you imagined.
And don't shy away from that complexity either. The ancient Greeks, like all human societies, were full of contradictions and nuances. There's always more to learn and discover about them and about ourselves in the process.
Well said.
Thanks for joining us on this fascinating deep dive into ancient Greek sexuality. It's clear that there's still so much to uncover and reconsider when it comes to understanding this ancient culture. And remember, history is a conversation. It's up to all of us to keep asking questions, exploring different perspectives, and piecing together the puzzle of the past. Until next time.